So it is with great pleasure that I invite Sean to this podium to tell us a little bit about the afternoon's proceedings.
Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. That was very nice. I want to repeat a few of Peter's sentiments in my own introduction to acknowledge the support and the friendship that I've got from this institution and from the American Museum of Natural History. So as Peter observed, Frontier Shores is the fourth in a series of successful collaborations in museum anthropology between the Bard Graduate Center and the American Museum of Natural History. This cooperation provides the opportunity to explore the museum's collections in an intellectual, cultural, and historic context. I'd first like to thank those who had the vision to set this partnership up, chiefly Peter Miller and Susan Weber from the BGC, and John Flynn and Laurel Kendall from the AMNH. I feel extremely privileged to have been given this opportunity to curate at the BGC. The institution provides an engaging environment for relatively niche exhibitions on a larger stage, the largest stage being New York. I'd particularly like to thank Ivan Gaskell, the head of the Focus Project, for his support. Likewise, the director of the gallery, Nina Stritzler-Levine, leads a talented team of individuals without whom such gallery projects could never achieve the excellence for which the center has become known. Bard's greatest resource, of course, like most good universities, is its students. And I'd like to acknowledge those dedicated and insightful students I've had the privilege to teach here and who all contributed substantially to the curatorial process of my exhibition. This exhibition was made richer through the kind cooperation of other institutions such as the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard, the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Tiwi Land Council back in Australia, who have been generous with the loan of objects, permissions, and expertise. Finally, I'd like to offer my profound thanks to those whom the collection process has made invisible or anonymous, the manufacturers of the material culture, which is the focus of Frontier Shores. When I pitched my concept of an exhibition to the BGC, I knew it had two simple rules which I had to adhere to. The first was that I had to have a museum anthropology project. The second, that it had to encompass as much of Oceania as was realistically possible. Oceania is a somewhat fluid term, and it's a means of uniting, semi-awkwardly, geography and culture across a vast distance, encompassing Australia, New Zealand, New Guinea, and the tropical islands of the Pacific Ocean, and encapsulating people of very different backgrounds and cultures. I knew that to attempt to blend so many island groups together in one exhibition had a serious risk of homogenizing the people that I was discussing. My cure for that problem was to draw attention to the process of homogenization through the exhibition itself. So, although Frontier Shores is about the colonial entanglements of cross-cultural contacts that took place during the 19th and early 20th centuries in Oceania, it is more specifically about how these entanglements were derided or ignored in order to conform to the prevailing cultural and scientific attitudes of European powers who sought to dominate the region. Race, politics, and collecting were intertwined in the colonial era. Yet, a reconsideration of the research used can show us ways in which exploited peoples can exert their agency in this time, or then and now. The exhibition showcases 39 objects, the majority from the Museum of Natural History, collected from the 1830s to the early 1950s, that demonstrate the richness of cultural contact in Oceania and the ways in which this material was often used to construct an imagined identity through cultural tradition. The exhibition highlights the objects themselves and, with one clear exception, deliberately avoids the narrative of collector stories. So the objects, not the collectors, become the focus. And the reason I did this was very simple, because in almost all cases of collections from this era, the manufacturer is completely anonymous. Why should the collector get the credit when the artist gets none? So that anonymity is explored in this exhibition and the accompanying text, which look at the ways in which collections of material culture from the various native peoples of Oceania were employed or interpreted to construct an image of native identity dictated by moral and scientific discourse, as well as political expedience. During this period, the terms of moral discourse concerning European domination over colonial subjects had shifted from the religious to the scientific, Scientific theory was often employed to rationalize how and why political dominance had been or should be obtained over others. The key element of this was the placement of non-Europeans, especially those people defined rather broadly as savages, lower than Europeans on an evolutionary scale. That scientific discourse was in part based on material evidence. As anthropologists of the era evaluated the composition of objects and their uses against a hierarchy of technological development. Yet the colonial governors, agents, and observers who actually interacted with the people of Oceania were often humanists themselves, and to a small degree, my exhibition explores some of those stories, men like Archibald Meston and Otto Finch, with very problematic histories themselves in relationships to indigenous peoples. In using frontier in the title of the exhibition, I was fully aware that the word is problematic for many. The word is a strong link to imperial ideas of the periphery, and researchers have constantly sought alternatives such as the contact zone, the liminal space, or more recently, the beach. Not to denigrate these alternatives, I felt that frontier had a more immediate resonance and metaphoric weight. In this project, I have engaged with the imagination of the frontier through the use of objects in museums and in the text resources associated with these collections and the people from whom the collections come. I see the frontier as a zone of interaction and accommodation, of contact and adaptation. In particular, the material record in collections offers profound evidence of adaptation and accommodation on the part of the peoples of the Pacific. The collection of objects for metropolitan museums is also a history of how the frontier, and specifically native peoples on the frontier, were viewed by Europeans operating far from this contact zone. In a sense, the museum, therefore, became the frontier space. We could term them perhaps as a kind of a glass frontier, and I have suggested through my exhibition, hopefully not too overtly, that the object itself is the frontier of cultural negotiation. So, Frontier Shores primarily is an exploration of how the theory of entanglement, first introduced in Nicholas Thomas's Entangled Objects, applied practically as an analytical tool for examining material culture in a particular period and place. Central to this analysis are the ways in which the perception and interpretation of things are dictated by social and scientific attitudes. That perception was often influenced by ideas of tradition, at the time understood as meaning primitive or natural cultural traits. Tradition, however, is a more universal and fluid concept, one that refers to the way of thinking and acting that, as David Gross has written, exists in the present but was inherited from the past. Other ideas of tradition are linked to Benedict Anderson's concept of the imagined community and the manufacture of identity. As he argued, for a whole nation to be imagined, the limits of the nation must also be imagined. Those limits are finite boundaries beyond which other nations and people exist, who are definitely other. This context explains why the classification and perception of the material culture explored in Frontier Shores is as much about the social attitudes as about the material itself. Entanglement is, in fact, a mostly unremarkable phenomenon when we think about it, because cultural contact is, especially today, an ever-present reality of daily life. New York itself is the perfect example of this. The historic landing spot of disenfranchised Europeans seeking a better life or fleeing a worse one, it still serves as the nexus point for peoples from various cultures coming to America, either as tourists or otherwise. A stroll across the city now will likely result in hearing multiple languages being spoken within earshot, while seeing sites of blended and multi-layered cultural practices which our 19th century ancestors would have found unusual. There are Asian restaurants which serve food primarily designed for Western palates, clothing stores who sell European designs made by children in Indonesia or China, and migrant workers in every walk of city life. So these are everyday examples of cross-cultural contact, some obviously mundane, some more sinister. Yet despite these regular reminders of entanglement and the malleability of cultural identity, there are still many today who argue that for, argue for or write popular books on very Victorian-era notions, such as the popular Before They Pass Away, which tells it that because a young man in New Guinea is drinking from a Coke can, that he is essentially losing his cultural identity. Yet the reverse is very rarely argued, that, for example, because the English enjoy tea, they are Chinese. The everyday nature of entanglement becomes more interesting when we consider how it is interpreted by people, how it relates to cultural identities, and what it demonstrates in regards to human engagement in the past and the present. One such present entanglement is Frontier Shores itself. New York is now at the center of what I've heard called the Pacific Moment. Exhibitions and events exploring the cultural legacy of Pacific peoples have been very successfully staged, and very recently. In Boston, the Harvard Art Museum's Everyone exhibition by Stephen Gilchrist, exploring Aboriginal Australian art, opened at the start of this year. Last year, 2 exhibitions on Aboriginal culture opened across the Atlantic at the British Museum. Uli Luisi, a Tongan artist and narrator for the Napoleon Bonaparte piece of Frontier Shores, has just had his own art show, which explores the idea of motion and dialectic transitions from the traditional to the contemporary, open at the Limner Gallery in Manhattan's East Village. I could go on and cite more such instances in individual specific interests or origins operating now in New York. In the interest of brevity, I humbly put forward my exhibition and this symposium as one more showcase of the ingenuity, legacy, and endurance of the Pacific world and of its interconnectedness with the rest of the world. So this symposium presents 4 seminar presentations exploring the historic and contemporary entanglement of Oceania with the rest of the world. This symposium is merely the first of one of many public programming events. For those interested, you can find more details on these later, which are running from now until the end of June. But these presentations at the seminar will deal with a diverse range of material from collections and interactions in New Guinea, Polynesia, and Australia. The BGC live streams and records presentations at symposiums, but this will not be done for the first of these presentations. This is in order to respect cultural sensitivity and images and issues, so those watching the live stream will miss this, unfortunately, but they can tune in again for the remainder from 20 to 3. The first presentation is by Dr. Jennifer Newell and Dr. Paige West, entitled Artists and Ancestors, Exploring the Potency of Reconnections with Museum Collections. Dr. Jennifer Newell is Curator of Pacific Ethnography at the American Museum of Natural History. Her work deals with material culture and the relationship between Pacific Islanders and the environment. Dr. Newell was previously at the British Museum and the National Museum of Australia, and has worked closely with Pacific diaspora communities. Dr. Newell has written on exchange and contextual meanings of objects, for example, in relation to Tahitian and European contact in the 18th and 19th centuries, or in the British Museum's Pacific collection. Her current research now focuses on climate change and cultural change in the Pacific. Alongside this, she also looks at the role of museums in providing places for connecting and reconnecting communities with their heritage. Dr. Paige West is a professor of anthropology at Columbia University, with 20 years' experience working with the indigenous people of Papua New Guinea. Dr. West has co-founded a school and an NGO to foster education in the region. Her dissertation was on cultural and environmental anthropology at Rutgers University, developing a broad scholarly interest in the relationship between societies and their environments. Dr. West's current projects include looking at climate change through work with scientists, politicians, and policymakers in island communities, and in an examination of dispossession and material culture in New Ireland. I should mention here that each seminar is set to run for roughly 50 minutes. I leave it to the discretion of the speaker how much of they want to use up with their actual talk and how much they'll allow for questions. But we'll probably get around about 10 or 15 minutes worth of questions at the end of each. At the end of the second talk, we'll break for 20 minutes for a coffee break. But as for now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Newell and Dr. West to the stage.